Hi, everyone. Welcome to Let's Give More, a podcast where we talk about the role of loving kindness in our everyday lives and the impact it makes on our world. I have today with me Dr. Natalie Papini. She is a assistant professor at Northern Arizona University. Natalie, so glad to have you here. I'm excited to talk about the role that self-compassion plays in our world.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I love the mission of this podcast, and I could talk about self-compassion forever. And so just tell me when you need me to stop talking about it.
No, that's awesome. I'm really looking forward to this. This is something that I have been interested in for a very long time. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about what drew you to self-compassion in the first place?
Sure. So I came out to Northern Arizona University as a graduate student, and I had just finished up a collegiate softball career. And I had battled injury and some other just mental health issues throughout college. And my mentor at the time in the psych program at NAU introduced me to self-compassion. I fell in love with the concept, not just as a budding scientist, but also as someone who saw a lot of value in incorporating self-compassion into my everyday life.
Yeah, that's great. For those that don't know, though, could you tell us maybe what you mean by self-compassion, and how does that differ from like just self-esteem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at its core, self-compassion really is just acknowledging and recognizing that you yourself are worthy of the same compassion that you give to other people. So often when people are struggling or they're experiencing adversity, they can be really critical of themselves or really hard on themselves. And self-compassion is just a really different alternative way of approaching yourself when you're going through a hard time that involves treating yourself as you would a good friend or someone that you admire or love. And it is different from self-esteem. So self-esteem is really this sort of like comparative process where my self-esteem depends on how I'm doing compared to other people. So if I perceive that I'm doing better than other people, I might have high self-esteem. But if I perceive that I'm not doing as well as other people, whether that be in my performance at work or, if I'm a kid, if I take a test and I've not done as well as my peers, then what we see is that self-esteem can drop and can decrease. And there are some adverse mental health effects of that. And so you don't see that same issue with self-compassion because it's not this sort of comparative process. It really is, when you've failed an exam or something hasn't gone the way that you anticipated it's gone, you're able to sort of support yourself through it in a kind and caring way.
That's interesting. Would you say that self-compassion is more an approach to yourself?
Totally, yeah. So it really is this different way of treating yourself. And a lot of the people that I've either worked with in different capacities, like clients that I've worked with directly, and even students that I've taught over the years at NAU, it seems easy to do at face value. And then when you start even just becoming more aware of how you speak to yourself when you're going through something difficult, people find that it actually is relatively challenging if you have sort of this history of being unkind or critical of yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting. What a cool thing to be able to teach your students. I imagine they get a lot out of it.
It is one of my favorite parts of my job. Yeah. And I think using examples for students that are relevant to them. So, we'll talk about failing an exam or not getting the internship that you wanted or having a bad body image day or a really hard day at work. What does that look like? And how do you speak to yourself when you notice those things? And then typically I'll ask them, how would you speak to a friend who was in your position there? And often what they learn in that simple question is they speak very differently to a friend or a family member than they do to themselves when they're struggling. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of opens up the conversation to figure out, what does treating yourself kindly when you're really going through it? What does that look like? What does that sound like? And there are so many exercises and activities that you can do to increase your self-compassion.
Yeah, that's interesting. I I had someone tell me a very long time ago, when I was going through a time where I was particularly hard on myself, and I was talking to this friend about it, and I was saying some pretty difficult things about myself. I was really feeling upset at the things I wasn't doing right, and they told me, like, would you say that to a friend? Would you say what you just said about yourself to a friend? And it really, it's one of those moments that's stuck with me. And I've had the good fortune of being able to say that to my friends. This is probably 20 years back, but I think that's such an interesting thing that we're always very kind, or not always, but we're often very kind to our friends. We wouldn't say the kinds of things to our friends that we say to ourselves.
Yeah, and that actually is something that I'll use too, is if students are like, how do I know what I'm saying to myself is compassionate or not? It's a really easy way to check that is to just ask them, would you say that to someone who's in your same position that you care about, someone that you admire and respect? Would you say that to them? And if you wouldn't, that's a pretty good sign that it's probably not self-compassionate.
Right. That's a good point. That's a good point. What would you say are the most, how is it misunderstood? How is self-compassion misunderstood?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's also some of what sparks my research, actually, is understanding different groups that haven't always been studied when it comes to self-compassion, and what are some of the barriers that they experience when it comes to practicing self-compassion. So I think the biggest sort of misunderstanding around this concept is, well, if I'm kind to myself, how am I going to be motivated to do things? Like, if I treat myself kindly, then am I just going to get complacent? And that is one of the biggest barriers of a lot of people when it comes to their willingness to practice self-compassion. They think, I'll be kind to myself, I'll get complacent, and then I won't be driven to do any other things. But the research actually supports a different sort of story there. What we see is that people who are kinder to themselves during adversity or during failure or hardship are generally able to, or more willing to take bigger risks. And they have the coping skill through self-compassion to work through it and learn from failure or adversity, at least more about themselves. And so when you're self-compassionate during times of failure or struggle, you may not be experiencing as much stress during the failure or adversity, which allows you to be more creative and problem solve a little bit easier. So there are so many benefits to this, and we actually see that people experience more motivation when they have higher levels of self-compassion, that because they're kinder to themselves and they understand that failure is part of the common human experience, and they're able to kind of sit within a difficult experience and not be so judgmental about it, that their motivation to do something actually increases because they're not maybe so experiencing so much distress over failure or the idea of failure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm eager. I'm excited to talk about the research side of it with you, because I feel like this is something I've been interested in. A lot of people are interested in, but in like an anecdotal way. We think about and we talk about these kinds of things, and there's lots of, you'll see memes and things about self-care and all of that. But before we dive into the research, I wanted to ask you, because I know from talking to you previously that you were an athlete in college, and more specifically, you were a pitcher in college, and that's a pressure position. And my kids all played sports. They played softball, they played hockey, and I remember telling my kids, and really my son, he had a challenge with this. He would be so hard on himself. He was a goalie in hockey, and that's a position that has a lot of pressure associated with it as well. And we used to talk about this, about not turning one mistake into multiple mistakes by getting mad. And we would reference it and basically say, when you get mad as a goalie, when you get upset and when you get mad at yourself or when you get down on yourself, you're done. It's hard to focus on that next shot when you're reliving the ones that got by you behind. And so I guess I'm wondering, you hadn't studied this yet, but looking back at your, you know, college career playing sports, would this have been helpful to you to know
Oh, yeah.
back then? Did you have a problem with that at all?
Totally. Yeah. And that's part of why, the 1 year out from finishing up my collegiate career, I was sort of exposed to this and was thinking exactly that. Like, man, I wish I would have known about this sooner. It would have made playing in college, I think, a lot more enjoyable. Yeah, and there is a lot of research on self-compassion in athletics that has really come about in the last 5 to 7 years. We're seeing self-compassion be introduced even at the Olympic level because it's so important in helping athletes be more mindful of failure and adversity, but also treating themselves in a way that allows them to work through it productively instead of, like you said, maybe impairing their performance in the future or just leading to poor mental health in general. It's very well established that physical and mental health are very intertwined. And so I think you've seen in the last decade or so a major push, not just from the NCAA, but also at the professional level, of making sure athletes' mental health is where it needs to be in order to help them perform well. And self-compassion is certainly part of that conversation. And we've seen where, helping athletes be more self-compassionate has led to improved free throw shooting percentage at the college level and allows Olympic athletes to have greater levels of resilience to be more competitive in their sport.
So they're actually applying the science of self-compassion to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because most of us, especially as we get older, we're not playing a sport and certainly not a competitive sport at that level. And I think sports are an interesting analogy because the pressure's on, the spotlight's on, and so it sort of amplifies the things we go through. And I've seen it in those instances affect my kids' performance on the field or whatever, but in everyday real life, we go through a lot of the same concerns. We make a mistake and then maybe we carry it around or we are hard on ourselves. And I can, from my point of view, I can think of a lot of instances where I've let that get in the way of my motivation,
Yeah.
to or even my creativity to find a positive solution.
Right. Yeah. And, I think to kind of put it out of the athletic context and back into, everyday life for most people, self-compassion has been used in the research a lot lately to look at burnout in different occupations, especially, I work in the health sciences. So a lot of the literature I read is related to health and healthcare. Burnout in nurses, burnout in health-related fields, students who are pursuing health-related fields, burnout among physicians. These are all really important things that collectively we know, we're going to face shortages in these really crucial healthcare roles. How can we help them be kinder to themselves when they are experiencing burnout, and how does that influence burnout in these different fields? These are all sort of areas of research that are currently being done with self-compassion.
Yeah, I can imagine because it seems like that makes an impact in our productivity, and sometimes it takes framing it in terms of productivity to get it to the point where people have the will to look into it. But, just on an everyday level, human beings just existing, absent the pressure to be productive, we should, in my opinion, see ourselves as something that's worthy of kindness and love and compassion. I'm interested, though, if you don't mind, I'm interested in getting into the research side of it.
Yeah.
What does the research have to say about self-compassion?
So generally, the research shows that people with higher self-compassion experience lower levels of anxiety and lower levels of depression. And that self-compassion really seems to help people engage in certain health behaviors like physical activity and has even been linked to certain nutrition habits. So there's really seems to be this benefit of self-compassion when it comes to physical and mental health. My area of research specifically, I look at the link between self-compassion and eating behaviors, specifically binge eating. And I've also done some qualitative interview work to look at barriers and facilitators to practicing self-compassion, specifically in men, because they're such an underrepresented group in that literature, in that research.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting close to home for me there, because that's my, if I'm having a tough time, like so many of us, I might engage in activities of eating, especially that's not healthy, and especially when I'm in a really challenging headspace. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
How does self-compassion affect our ability to manage stress?
So when you're experiencing a high level of stress, like let's say if I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10 how stressed you are, you said, I'm a 9 or I'm a 10 out of 10. There are neurological changes that happen in your brain that essentially impair your ability to problem solve and be creative. And when you're experiencing a lot of stress, what do you usually need to do? Problem solve and be creative, right?
Yeah.
So self-compassion really can allow someone to experience a stressful situation. And there are 3 core components to self-compassion. One is you're mindful. You're in the moment. You're not trying to resist that the moment is difficult. You're not trying to be overabsorbed into it, but you are aware this is a difficult moment. I'm not going to try to ignore it or whatever, but I'm just going to allow myself to really be in it non-judgmentally as best I can. The second piece is recognizing that stress is part of the human experience, right? We all experience stress on some level, in some way, sometimes in our lives more than others, but it's part of what makes us human and connects all of us. And so the second piece of self-compassion is this idea of common humanity, or, that failure or adversity or stress are part of what makes us human and part of what allow us to sort of get each other. And it really can help people feel less isolated or alone when they're going through something difficult. And then the third piece is that self-kindness piece. Can you treat yourself like you would a close friend or someone that you love after you recognize I'm in a stressful situation? Other people also go through this, so I know I'm not alone. What can I really do to support myself through this? And so by doing that, by engaging in sort of those 3 steps, often what happens is people don't have, the extreme response to stress as they otherwise would, because they're able to be a little bit more level-headed and emotionally regulate a little bit better so that they're able to problem solve and they're able to come up with, real solutions or ideas on how to work on their stress or improve it.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm hearing a lot of acceptance in this, and I'm also hearing a lot of just almost observing it and letting it unfold without feeling bad about it. Is that right?
Yeah, the non-judgmental, mindful piece is really critical, and it's something that can be difficult for a lot of people because our brains naturally want to say yes, no, good, bad, right, wrong. And so when you're being really mindful, what you're trying to do is just say, this is what it is, and how can I show up for myself in this moment?
Yeah, that's a great one. I'm going to ask you the $1 million question though now. What about when I'm in the moment and I don't like myself or I'm mad? How do you flip that switch? Is it just practice?
Yeah, it takes time. This is a skill like any other skill. You didn't walk into a weight room and immediately start knowing how to do the exercises. You didn't, one day just wake up and decide to run a marathon. You took months and months of practice to work, those muscles and to get to that point. And the same goes for self-compassion. This is a really intentional process. And one thing that I so appreciate about Dr. Kristen Neff, who is really sort of the self-compassion lady, she's the one who's really sort of been the lead researcher in this field, is that she makes those exercises freely available on her website. So they're not behind a paywall. Someone could go to the selfcompassion.org website right now and access those exercises and start to engage in exercises that have been shown through research to be effective in improving self-compassion.
Yeah, I didn't. Okay, so I'm just learning about this. There's a selfcompassion.org. Talk to me about that. What else is there besides Dr. Sharon Neff? Is that right?
No, Dr. Kristen Neff. Yeah,
Kristen.
close.
Okay.
Yeah. It's an incredible website. I could talk about it for a long time, but if you're a everyday person looking for ways to be more self-compassionate, there are guided meditations that you can do. There are also like written journal types of activities. There are also really simple activities like that really get you in the space of practicing mindfulness, like soles of your feet, where you just pay attention to sort of the weight of your soles of your feet on the earth beneath you and how that feels. So often we go through our lives and we're not even really paying attention to like sensations of things. And just by doing these simple acts, we can become more mindful. There's another one that's called, self-compassionate break. And it's pretty self-explanatory, but taking a break and really kind of helping yourself through a moment or giving yourself a moment. Compassionate touch. So even just something as simple as placing your hand on your chest, and, allowing yourself to just feel soothed by that. There's so many practices, and depending on what you're looking for, there's probably something for you. And then for researchers, she makes all of the research scales available on that website as well. So if you're like, how do I incorporate self-compassion into my next project? There are ways to measure it that she makes free and available on her website.
Right on. We'll figure out how to put that link
Cool.
in wherever you put links.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, you must be a pro then at self-compassion. Since you're teaching it, you must never have a negative thought about yourself. Is that right?
I wish. Yeah. No. No. And I get that question from students a lot, or I get, hey, like you've been teaching stress management for 10 years. Are you like, have you figured it out?
Yeah,
Are you there? And I'm like, oh my gosh, no. I am a lot better than I was 10 years ago. Like I mentioned, when my mentor introduced me to self-compassion, I want to believe she knew what she was doing too. I'm sure she saw it. But, if you can imagine writing both a thesis and a dissertation on the topic of self-compassion, these are incredibly sort of trying times when you're writing those things and gutting it out and trying to advance science. And it was funny because I would say something mean to myself and then I'd be like, oh my gosh, your topic is on self-compassion. So I think even just catching when that happens and the awareness piece of noting, oh, that wasn't a very kind thought, that is powerful in and of itself. So if you're not even ready to practice self-compassion, just paying attention to what you're saying to yourself and going, oh, that was a difficult or a little bit harsh of a thought that I just had. How might I change that?
Yeah, and maybe just learning to identify the behaviors, and sort of turning away from those.
Yep, exactly.
That's interesting. I'm hearing a lot about being present, and a lot about sort of being okay with what's happening to you or what you've done. And I think that's interesting because on a personal level, I've really spent maybe the last decade really working on that. And I've found that the extent to which I can stay present is I end up being happier if I can stay in that present space. And so is that the major component of self-compassion is being in the moment?
It's one of the three. Yeah. It goes back to that mindfulness piece of allowing yourself to be present, even when the present moment isn't great.
Right. Or the future moment. Like for me, that's a big one is I notice and I think a lot of people are having concerns about the future, and the present. And, I notice that when I'm in those head spaces, when I'm thinking too much about the future, it's awfully hard to feel happy and peaceful, and it affects my my ability to be kind to myself as well.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what we see. So that's really also where my research comes in, right? Is you recognize that you go through something difficult or you're really experiencing sort of poor mental health, and then that can influence your behaviors. So maybe, you're more likely to eat in a way that you might not normally, whether that be more food than what's normal for you or less. And so that's where, like, my dissertation was really focused on, does self-compassion influence binge eating? Specifically in men, again, because men are really challenging sometimes to recruit in research studies, but also they're so underrepresented in this literature. So we wanted to be able to examine, does this really seem to matter, move the needle at all when it comes to men who are pursuing weight loss, and if those two are connected, self-compassion and binge eating.
Yeah. Do you see a direct connection between someone's self-compassion and their body image?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's some of the work that I've done with people during pregnancy, is looking at, because obviously pregnancy is your body goes through a lot of physical changes throughout that period. And then into postpartum, we see a lot of poor body image concerns that can crop up for some people, such as, like, there's this sort of bounce back idea where your body would go back to what it was pre-pregnancy. But for so many people, that doesn't happen. So how can people sort of relate to their body in a different way using self-compassion? And so I've actually used some of the materials on Dr. Neff's website, some of the meditations to help people during pregnancy go through a self-compassion meditation program. And then I've looked at body image over time, and we see that for people who were engaged in the self-compassion meditation, their body image improved compared to a control group where their body image did not significantly improve. So there seem to be things that people can do to move the needle and to improve body image, and to use self-compassion to do so.
That's awesome. Is that part of your stress management class? Do you teach that in stress management?
So in stress management, I want to give my students so many different, we're dipping our toe in the water of all kinds of different ways that we manage stress. So we do things from time management and practicing assertive communication and setting boundaries with, your messy roommate or a partner who maybe is, you struggle to communicate with. We do that all the way through self-compassion, progressive muscle relaxation, meditation. So we don't spend nearly as much time as I wish we had on each different skill, but we do spend a day on self-compassion, and they do complete sort of the self-compassion writing prompt that they turn in. I have a lot of students at the end of the course that say, I didn't realize, how mean I was to myself until we covered
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Like, what a great class. And you must get a lot of feedback from students in ways that it's affected their lives.
Yeah, when I first started teaching the class, it was almost like it was 2018, and some students didn't love it because they didn't really think it was relevant. And I think since we've gone through collectively a lot, including a pandemic, I have not had that experience in 5 years. I think college students especially, and if you're working in the space, you see it every day, right? Like, there's a lot of mental health concerns going on with young people right now. And I think ever since the 2020 pandemic, my students have been on the opposite end of, like, we need this, we recognize its importance. And on one hand, I'm really bummed that it took a pandemic for some of that to happen.
Right.
And some students just aren't going to be interested. It's just not going to be their favorite topic, and that's okay. But for a lot of students, I think I've seen a huge shift in just recognizing how important it is. I get a lot of really good feedback from that class. Like, it's always I feel really lucky that I get to teach classes where students can apply skills to their everyday life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's without going too far down the rabbit hole. I think we're all going through a lot, and there's a lot going on right now, and this is needed more now than ever, and so it's pretty valuable. In what ways have you seen this impact? Do you get feedback from your students? Are they putting these things into practice?
Yeah, my favorite example is with the assertive communication segment. That one student used it and got a raise at his job, which was really cool. I wasn't expecting that, but I was happy that assignment helped him sort of get a script for change together. But yeah, with self-compassion, I think a lot of my students will tell me, like, I've really sort of started to just be more aware of how I talk to myself. And I may or may not be ready to change the way I talk to myself, but I recognize now when I'm mean. And I think that's a really good first step.
Yeah, it feels like this is one of those, self-compassion is one of those things that maybe can be a little stigmatized, I bet. Like, I think it seems like maybe people could confuse that for like softness. I think we started talking about that earlier.
Yeah, and narcissism too.
Right.
Like, I don't want to be so, like, if I'm nice to myself, it feels a little self-indulgent. Yeah. And that's a really difficult sort of misunderstanding around self-compassion, because loving yourself and treating yourself with kindness does not mean that you're a narcissist, or doesn't mean that you're narcissistic. Like, there are very clear DSM-5 criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. And there's not really any overlap with treating yourself kindly when you're experiencing something hard or difficult. And so, it's helping people sort of unpack why they believe that.
Yeah.
When I'm working with like clients in a one-on-one setting, especially back when I was health coaching a lot, I think it's really asking some of those questions to clients about, where do you think that belief about treating yourself kindly is self-indulgent or selfish? Where do you think that comes from? And like, when do you first remember sort of having some of those ideas?
Yeah.
And helping them explore it and maybe consider if it's really true for them.
Sure. Where do you think it comes from? What are is it cultural narratives that are pushing this?
I think so. And I see it a lot more in women typically, just because women are really supposed to be selfless.
Yeah.
And sacrifice a lot for other people and nurturing. And a lot of women, I think, sort of have this idea that if I'm kind to myself, I'm spending time on myself that I'm not spending for other people. And it's really hard to give your all in other areas if you're totally drained, or if in the background you're just beating yourself up sort of mercilessly. So it's really helping people to take a step back and think about, okay, but if you were to be kinder to yourself, how might that actually improve some of the ways that you give to other people? Right. And so sometimes it just takes some self-reflection and some time.
Have you seen those narratives changing? I mean, now that we're seeing some research in the subject. Is it influencing the narratives?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I've seen a lot more about self-compassion on the internet, on social media in the last 5 years than I ever did the first 7 years that I studied it. And so I do think it's becoming more of this mainstream idea and something that people are kind of gravitating toward.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen posts that say self-care isn't selfish, and I would say self-compassion isn't selfish either. Right. It's really just one way that you can take care of yourself.
What is the difference between self-care and self-compassion?
Well, I think self-care can involve so many different behaviors. Self-care could be me taking 5 minutes and sitting in silence. Self-care could be me, paying my bills, or making sure I go to the dentist, right? There are all sort of these behaviors that fall under self-care. Self-compassion really gets at, how do you relate to yourself when you're going through something difficult? How do you talk to yourself? How do you feel about yourself? What do you say? Yeah. And can we be in a moment that's tough, and can we change the way that we talk to ourselves and recognize that the hardship that you're going through, someone else has also gone through? Sure.
Is it as simple as saying like self-care is like a practice or a practical application, and self-compassion is more kind of an approach, a belief? Mm-hmm. Is that...
Well, no, I think self-compassion is an activity too. Like I mentioned, there are really specific ways that people can practice self-compassion and improve it. So I would say it's a behavior.
Well, that's good, because the next question was, what ways can people practice? Like maybe we could go through, I know we've talked a little bit about it already, but what are some of the tips you've picked up along the way?
Of practicing self-compassion? Yeah. I think there's two key things that I think are first really important to just note about practicing self-compassion. One is called backdraft, and it's this idea that especially for people who maybe have early life experiences with trauma or a lot of adverse childhood experiences, when they start to be kind to themselves, they can actually experience a lot of emotional reactivity. And the term really does come from firefighters who, if a house is burning or something like that, and you open a door and you allow oxygen in, what can happen is a huge sort of combustion. And the same can happen emotionally with people who have sort of trauma in their history and start practicing self-compassion. So I think it's really important just to note that, because everyone's coming to this practice with different experiences in life in different places, and you don't want to be surprised or caught off guard by that. So that's step one. The other thing that I think is really important and really, really important for future study, this is so understudied in the literature, but there's this variable or this idea, it's called fear of self-compassion. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's this way that we measure how afraid someone is to extend compassion to themselves. And it can really be also, it seems to be really important when it comes to some of the health behaviors that people engage in, and also seems to be associated with mental health like depression and anxiety. And so I think for people to understand those two things before they even start practicing, and the fear of self-compassion scale exists. So even if someone out there wanted to take it and score it up themselves, you could do that to kind of understand where you're at with your comfortability of practicing self-compassion and bringing that practice into your life. But I would say start small. You don't need to start practicing you don't have to go from 0 to 100 to see a benefit. It really can be a 5-minute practice a day, or even less than that, to start seeing some real tangible benefit to your overall mental health and well-being. So that's my biggest piece of advice for someone who's beginning with this practice. And the second piece of advice I give is just, in the same way you don't build muscle without repetition, you don't build self-compassion doing it one time. It really does have to become more of a consistent type of practice. And again, it doesn't have to be a huge investment in time, but just making sure that you are practicing it maybe a couple times a week, 2 or 3 times, and then checking in with yourself after you practice it, and just, being aware of how you feel, noticing how you feel for a couple hours after, can be really useful for some people.
Yeah, I hope this isn't too much of a departure, but for me, a big thing that's helped me with this, because I've been making an attempt to be more kind to myself. And for me, the component that helped with that is honesty. I found that when I was not being kind to myself, I was also not being very accurate. I would say things like, you always do this, or you never do that, or very definitive, I am not up to this task, even though I might be up to this task. So, and I don't know if any of your research has kind of touched on that, but for me, those two go hand in hand, and I try to grant myself the benefit of being accurate. And saying things internally that might be like, instead of going, I always do this wrong, I might say, just reframe it in my mind and go, I struggle with this, and I haven't learned how to do it yet, but I'm working at this. Instead of I always do it wrong.
Yeah, and part of the sort of mindful and common humanity piece is not to get overabsorbed, is to use these sort of all or nothing. So like the research term is called over-identification. I never get this right, or I'm always a failure, or this always happens to me. And it's these really like 0 or 100. We're either there or we're not. When in reality, it's often never that way. There's usually, sometimes I do that. And I think that it really speaks to that common humanity piece and the mindfulness piece of recognizing when you are speaking in those sort of all or nothings, helping yourself back to really evaluate it and question it. And I think just in doing that, it allows you to maybe be a little bit more compassionate.
Right. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is I wouldn't say those things to someone I care, to my kids.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Right. Think about the person that you love the most in the world, and like you value them more than anyone else. Like, who is that person for you? And 99.9% of the time, we say things to ourselves we would never, ever say to that person that we care about or that we love. So then the question really does become, well, why are we okay with saying that to ourselves?
Right.
What makes it okay about saying it to ourselves? And again, like in my clinical experience, it's helping people understand, well, then how does that influence how you go about the rest of your day when you are really mean to yourself? And usually people find like, yeah, I have a hard time sticking with my exercise goals when I'm, being a jerk to myself. And so, yeah, I really find a lot of value in helping students do that. And I feel so lucky that I get to research this and help people practice it through my intervention studies, but also, I'm tasked in a lot of my qualitative interview focus group type of studies with understanding it better from other people's perspectives and experiences so that we can really make sure that self-compassion is accessible to all people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because we will put so much effort and attention into other aspects of our personal development, right? Like there's no shortage of information online about how to work out and 50 different ways to do a bench press exercise, right? But there's not that, at least from where I sit, I haven't seen it. There's not in the culture at large, there's not as much emphasis and explanation on this part, developing that part too.
Well, physical health has had a sort of a 50-year head start in this country.
Right.
I think we've come so far in just being able to freely talk about mental health without it being stigmatized or sort of, no, don't go there. And I think, part of what, to your point, part of why we maybe don't know about this as much or it's not as widely circulated is because some people still aren't comfortable talking about mental health. And also, I think, we really prioritize physical health still when we think about health of a person.
Right.
But in reality, health is physical, it's mental and emotional, and it's all of these things. And when you impact physical health, mental health also is impacted. When you impact mental health, physical health is also impacted. So we really have to look at someone holistically.
Yeah. No, that's incredibly valuable. And it makes so much sense when you consider the individual, but there seems like there are also tremendous benefits for self-compassion, advocating for self-compassion in the world, at large in government and in healthcare and in our communities. Like it seems like there's a strong case to be made for compassion, self-compassion.
Yeah, my dream job is to work with small children on being kind to themselves, because when we get to children and self-compassion, really, childhood is such a malleable time. You can really help kids form habits that they'll take with them into adolescence and adulthood.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of difficult sometimes to work with adults on self-compassion because being critical of themselves is how they've operated for 50 years. So it's like, I don't even know another way to be. But with kids, there's not that history or that habit that's formed. And so there's just so much opportunity there to help them. And like, I know your podcast is about like universal love, compassionate love. And I just think that has to start with self-compassion. You really can't fully love someone else until you also love yourself. You have to be able to, treat yourself in a way that's kind in order to approach a partner who's going through something rough with the same kindness and care. Yeah.
Yeah, I know this is easy to say, but why isn't this taught to young people? Why do we wait until the ruts are laid down before we start talking about compassion and
I don't know.
Self-compassion?
I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I wish I did. And I'm sure there are places out there that are doing this work.
Yeah.
My sister's a therapist, and I know she works with young children on helping them be kind to themselves. So I think, people who are privileged enough to have access to a therapist or someone like that, maybe they're working on these skills. And maybe somewhere it's in curriculum. I don't know about it.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to look into that.
Yeah. It's an important thing, I think, to study. And I think it's something that we are, it's very relevant for today because it feels a little bit like compassion in general is maybe even being targeted a little these days. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but I think that this is something that we should be looking at more in society. We want to work well with one another and be good to each other. And I think this is a skill set that, like you said, kind of starts here with one person.
Yeah. And I think, self-compassion is a way that you can regulate your emotions. It's a way that you can allow yourself to kind of be a little bit more even-keeled and not so reactive. And so I think a lot of conflict sometimes can happen because you're, 10 out of 10 angry or you're experiencing a really strong emotion. And I think self-compassion is one way that sort of helps you level that out a little bit. And so to your point of like just some of the conflict that people are experiencing, whether that be socially, politically, whatever. And of course, me speaking for me, not for, my university or anything like that. But I think that self-compassion really probably could make a difference when it comes to how people approach conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess as we're wrapping it up here, going into, this next week or so, what's something that a person can do to get started with this right now?
Yes, so that's a great question. I really would encourage anyone who's interested on getting started to this. I would direct you to Kristen Neff's website,
Okay.
Dr. Kristen Neff, selfcompassion.org. She has listed so many activities on there, and it's hard for me to just throw out one because some people love to journal, other people can't stand it. Some people love to be physical or like physically active. There are self-compassion activities that sort of involve movement. So I really like to get to know a person and then maybe, offer some ideas of based on who they are. My personal favorite is a loving kindness meditation where you're thinking about other people and extending compassion and kindness to them. And then lastly, you're thinking about yourself and extending kindness and care to yourself. But that's me. And what I like might not be what someone else likes. So I would go to that website and just kind of browse those exercises and activities and find what you think might work for you.
Perfect. Are you working on anything now or coming up that you're excited about in this field?
Yes, I am doing a lot with self-compassion right now. I am on the second now intervention with people who are pregnant. We're looking at body image during pregnancy again, but we've really sort of revamped our self-compassion intervention this time. So we saw significant effects the first time, but this time we're doing things a little differently to see if those effects are even more so and stronger in terms of improving self-compassion and body image. And then I've got some really good work coming up with long-haul truck drivers that I'm excited about. Yeah, so I don't know if that will go in the path of self-compassion, but it could, and I'm excited for working with them and helping them specifically with sleep quality.
Well, when I think of long-haul truck drivers, I think of self-compassion. So I think that
doesn't everybody?
Yeah, that seems like a fun group and maybe a little challenging to work for. I mean, I know I'm painting with a broad brush here, but that's a pretty, independent group.
Really chaotic work schedules and work life, and they're so underserved when it comes to behavioral health research. So that's what I've got cooking right now. Right
on. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. And I love what you do. I'm so grateful that people out there are doing this because in my life changed dramatically when I learned, or as I'm learning, maybe is a better way to say it, to be more compassionate to myself. And it hasn't just changed me. And this is what's so great about, I think, self-compassion is that it's something that we can do for ourselves. We can do this without it doesn't take a lot of money. It doesn't take a membership. We can look into this and make these changes. And I've made some of these. I've incorporated some of these in my life, and my life has gotten significantly better as a result. And also, the people in my life, my relationships have been better. So, super grateful for this convo.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I just really strongly believe if you're going to talk about love for others, it really has to start with how you treat yourself also.
Yeah.
And so I'm just so excited about your series that you got going on, and happy to be a guest.
Yeah, I'm firmly convinced that what's the missing element in society today is empathy, kindness, love, compassion, charity. And I think I would go as far as to say that those are the paths to actual happiness. And we're bombarded all day long by all sorts of other paths. Buy this, look this certain kind of way. For me, I think when we talk about self-compassion, but also just empathy and love and charity and giving, these are the ways to real lasting joy and happiness. So I'm trying to make that my work.
Yeah, and it's admirable work, so thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. I really enjoyed having Dr. Papini in here to talk to us about self-compassion and kindness, and I'm looking forward to putting that into practice. So join us next time.